Let's kick it.
I'm Amanda Laird, host of the Heavy Flow podcast, and I'm kicking it with Doree.
Welcome to the Kicking It with Doree show. I am your host, Doree Allen Nieves, and today my guest is none other than Amanda Laird. Amanda Laird is a holistic nutritionist and host of the Heavy Flow podcast and an advocate for clear, intelligent exchange about health and wellness, particularly the topics we're not supposed to talk about, like your period. Welcome to the show, Amanda. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for having me, Doree. I'm so excited to be here with you today.
Awesome. Yeah, this is going to be really fun. I know you talk about this all the time. You have a podcast. You guys talk about this all the time, literally, but we don't. You know, this is a personal development podcast for women, but I think that that's something that we all have in common, even though 2018, women are still kind of feeling a little taboo or a little bit, self-conscious to talk about menstrual cycles and periods and bleeding. I mean, this is something that we've been doing since the beginning of time. This is part of the way that, we operate and bear children. But for some reason, it's just so taboo. So kudos to you and all the other women out there that are podcasting about our flows. What made you decide to start a podcast about this?
Ooh, well, that is a very good question. So I had started my work as a holistic nutritionist, and having been interested in menstrual and hormonal health pretty much all throughout my life. And then I really focused on that topic when I was in nutrition school. So when I started practicing as a holistic nutritionist, I was coaching clients about using food and lifestyle to improve their menstrual cycles and their hormonal health. So, using food and diet to help with PMS or infertility or women who had cysts. But what I started to notice in my practice is that I was spending more time talking to my clients about periods 101 and how their menstrual cycles work, how their hormones work in their bodies than I did about food. Because before we could get to the food part, I really had to break down what was going on in their bodies and causing them, painful periods or just to get their period, because it's just something we don't really know all that much about, right? So when I realized that it wasn't just one client, it was all my clients and, all my friends and all my female family members that I was having these same conversations over and over with. I really realized that there was something bigger going on here. And when I kind of zoomed out from my, little micro ecosystem of just my nutrition practice, I started to realize that it's a kind of a bigger, I think, social issue, and I would even say a feminist issue, that, women are just not taught about the very basics of their bodies, about something that happens once a month-ish, right? That's perfectly normal and is actually a really important indicator of our health. And when this big light bulb went off on my over my head, I realized that's it. That's the podcast. I want to start talking about menstruation. I want to start talking about periods. And with it, there are a lot of other topics as well that are kind of taboo that we don't talk about as well. It's all kind of rolled into one. And I want to start educating women and girls and other people who have periods about what is happening in their bodies so that they can feel empowered.
Yeah, that's really important. And I believe, even though this is almost like a cliche now, I really believe that it starts at home, and it starts with the attitude that the adult has or that role model has in the home with teaching that young girl about what's about to happen. My daughter, I talk about my daughter all the time on this podcast. I'm a typical mom. She is 14. And before, I want to say like maybe 3 years ago, I was going to the store and I needed to get tampons and I had to bring her with me. And she didn't understand what it was for, where you put it, any of that stuff. And I decided a long time ago that I was going to have an open relationship with my daughter just in general. But only give her information she needs to know, not give her information about like my personal life and things that she doesn't need to know as a child. But knowing about a period and what women go through, I felt was relevant, and that she was at that right age, around 10 or so. And so when I came back home from, getting the tampons, I showed her the insert and I explained what it was for. I explained why we bleed. I just talked to her and gave her the information that I thought she would want to know and that she needed to know, because what I didn't want to happen was, because of, the way our food is, Amanda, in this industry and how it's manufactured and how like it's obliterated before we get to it on our plate. I knew that there was a real possibility that she could start menstruating earlier than I did, because I started at 12. She, ended up starting later than me, but I knew it was a possibility. And so I didn't want her to be afraid. I didn't want her to go to the bathroom one day and be like, oh my God, I'm dying. I didn't want there to be anything scary about it. I wanted it to be normal, and I wanted her to know what to expect. And so we continue to have conversations about different things because, as women, we're not all the same, even though we all bleed. Some of us, we have pain at a certain time beforehand. We have PMS. I personally never had PMS. So I really think it's important that women or whoever is the role model in the home talks to their daughters about, what's going to happen and why it happens, and has an open kind of attitude about it.
Oh, for sure. I also have a daughter who I talk about all the time on my podcast, but she is not quite 14. She's just 2 years old. And even at 2 years old, I'm thinking, how can I raise my child to be period positive? And so we're right in that phase where I don't get any privacy at all. And so she's been in the bathroom with me when I have been, changing my menstrual cup or washing out my menstrual cup. And she's like, Mama, what's that? And so I just tell her exactly what it is. Oh, Mama has her period. It's perfectly normal. And I'm changing my menstrual cup. And she just kind of goes on her way. And now she knows when she sees the cup, she says, oh, Mama, do you have your period? And so to her, I just want to make sure that to her, it's just a normal thing that happens, right? And I think there's a lot to unpack here when you talk about it starts at home as well, because something that I have learned in my work as a nutritionist and having these conversations on my podcast is quite often what we learn is normal about a period, we learn from our moms or our sisters, right? And so often things that are common but not normal, like having a lot of PMS, or if you have a menstrual disorder like endometriosis, which causes extreme pain and very heavy bleeding, quite often that's genetic. There's some genetic components involved in that. So your mom or your sisters might also have the same period experience. And if that's what you know from the time that you're 12 or 14, then you're just going to think that that's normal. And I think that that can often prevent people from bringing up issues with healthcare providers or bringing it to their doctor, because if you're in excruciating pain every month with your period and your sister is and your mom is too, then you're going to think that's just normal, right? And it might not be until you get older and maybe you have a college roommate, or maybe you're chatting with your friends and you start to learn that, wait a second, you don't go to bed for, 3 days every time you get your period. It's not until you're like out in the world, right, that you might start to learn that that's not necessarily normal, or it doesn't have to be that way.
Or when you feel like you're in a comfortable kind of relationship, friendship, or situation that you can talk to. Like if you go to your doctor, you don't feel comfortable talking about the pain, or if you with one of your girlfriends and you're not feeling like you're able to talk about that, or your mom or whoever, if you don't feel like you're able to discuss this and that you have to keep it to yourself, or that you have to suffer in silence, that changes everything. Because like I said a minute ago, I've never had PMS. I have heard what it feels like. I've seen the commercials. I've seen things in movies, But I've never personally experienced that. So for me, pain is not normal. I would have never thought that, I would have to have cramps all the time. That's why I was really in for it when I had my daughter, because she's my only child. And I know people used to say to me when I was pregnant, okay, well, when you have the baby, it's going to be just like really, really, really bad cramps. And I'm like, well, I don't know what that is.
Right, right. Well, Dorit, to me, that says that you are in good hormonal health then, because we often think that your period is supposed to be dreadful, right? Like think about some of the euphemisms that we use for our period, right? It's called the curse, right? Or
that time of the month.
Exactly. Like there's always these negative kind of connotations around your period. And so we're kind of taught from a young age that your period, just from, society, because you listed all the places that you have seen and heard about PMS, right? Not having experienced it yourself. That's the representation that we have of our period in media and in our culture, right? That, oh, it's so dreadful, it's painful, it's so inconvenient, it's gross, it's shameful, when really it doesn't have to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, PMS is, I say this all the time with my clients, just because something is common doesn't mean it's normal. So the statistic is something like 3 out of 4 women experience some type of period pain. So the majority of people with periods are having painful periods, but it's actually not really normal. So yes, having a little bit of cramping, or having fatigue, or maybe you have a headache. I'm a headachy person, so I often get headaches around my period, not so much cramping or abdominal pain. So a little bit of those symptoms can be normal, but it should be, relatively easy to treat. Maybe you take a Tylenol and you go on your way. If it interrupts your day and your PMS is, preventing you from going to work, or you take a over-the-counter Tylenol or Advil or something like that and it doesn't work, like that is a symptom that your hormones are out of balance, and that's what's contributing to this period pain, and it does warrant further investigation. But because this is so pervasive in our culture, there's so many women who are literally suffering, every 30 days or every month, and they don't necessarily have to be.
Mm-hmm. We have to get over this fear of talking about this, because menstruation in and of itself is 1,000% normal. We have to get over these cultural stigmas that Amanda is mentioning here. You've given us a couple of little hints here, Amanda, about the normal period or menstrual cycle. I'd like you to break it down for people because, like you said, there's some people that feel like pain is normal and necessary evil, when it comes to this. But what does a normal period or menstruation cycle consist of?
Yeah, so that is a really great question. I think it's important, first of all, to talk about the menstrual cycle. So our period, which is, the couple of days out of the month that we're actually bleeding, gets all the glory and all the press, right? Because it is the most outward sign of our menstrual cycles. But it is important to remember that it is a cycle. So there are other hormonal things that are going on and fluctuations throughout our entire cycle that we need to think about as well. We don't really have to think about it because it's just kind of like humming along in the background. So it is a longer cycle, and that full cycle can be anywhere from 21 to 35 days. So often we hear 28 days as the length of a menstrual cycle. And I know a lot of women get worried if they fall on either side of that 28 days, but really that's just an average. And actually, I was doing some reading this week and I learned that the true average is actually 29.5 days. So I don't know why we got stuck on 28 days because that's not even true when it comes to what the average length is. So you can have a shorter cycle around 21 days or a longer cycle up to 35 days. So that's all considered normal. And then your actual period when you are bleeding can be anywhere from about 2 days to 7 days. And that blood should be, bright red, like cranberry juice is the kind of perfect example of what it should look like. And it should be free of any large clots as well. That's something a lot of women experience. And how much blood you're actually losing. Well, and it's not just blood, because there's, some other tissue in your menstrual flow. So it's made up of blood, some tissue from your uterine lining, and also some cervical mucus is in there as well. And it should be a maximum of about 80 milliliters over the course of your period. So that's about 16 tampons, or about 2.5, if you're using a menstrual cup, about 2.5 cups of your menstrual cup, not an actual cup. So if it's more than, soaking through 16 tampons, or you're, emptying a full menstrual cup every couple of hours, that's another sign that there could be something hormonal out of balance. And then again with PMS, some light cramping or fatigue or maybe a little headache, but it should be manageable and it shouldn't be interrupting your daily routine. So if you can't treat it with over-the-counter, pain relief, or diet and lifestyle, then that's another sign that something is not right.
That's very good. And Amanda, by the way, is from Canada. So she's using the metric system like we should be here in the US, but we're not. And so when she says cup, she's not talking about the actual measuring cup that we use in America. She's talking about like the menstrual cup, like a Diva cup or another brand. We're not sponsored here. So she's talking about the actual product, not the actual cup like what you use in the kitchen. When you're bleeding, you feel like, especially in the first couple of days, you feel like it's a lot. And it's like, oh my gosh. And, when you're young, you don't know.
I was actually quite shocked. Even somebody who has been interested in periods for, my whole life, I was really shocked that it's actually so little, because I think when you're using tampons or pads, even, it just kind of gets absorbed and goes away. And it's easy to think, oh my gosh, I'm like hemorrhaging, right? It's easy to think that you are losing so much blood. But when you switch to using a menstrual cup, it can be just really illuminating to see how much you're actually losing, right? I always recommend to my clients that if flow and if a heavy flow is actually one of their concerns, to try using a cup, because it'll give you a much more accurate picture as to how much you're actually losing, right? And I hear a lot of women say, oh yeah, I have a heavy flow. But when they actually start using a cup and they can actually physically see how much blood they're losing on their cycle, it's actually much less than what they thought when they were using a pad or a tampon.
Yeah. And I know it's a preference, which, you want to use and what works with your lifestyle and your cycle. I also want to talk about the importance of ovulation. We are focusing a lot on your period, of course, because like you said, that's the most obvious and outward thing that, we see with our menstrual cycle. But ovulation is a key component. And for many women listening that are interested in understanding more about their fertility, talk to us about the role of ovulation.
Yeah, for sure. So you are exactly right, Doree. Ovulation really is the kind of real star of the menstrual cycle. It's really the whole point of our menstrual cycle, right? And so ovulation is super important, and not just to the menstrual cycle, but ovulation and the hormones that are released during and after ovulation actually play a greater role in our overall health and wellness as well. So your menstrual cycle is actually considered to be your fifth vital sign. So it can tell you as much about your health and wellness as, say, a blood pressure or a pulse. And your ovulation can also contribute to breast health, heart health, and your bone health as well. Because some of the hormones that are involved in ovulation help with those other parts of your body too. So It is a super important function of our bodies. And I feel like every time I trot that out, it blows women's minds. And anytime I say that, I often hear, oh my God, I had no idea. I've never been taught that. I've never heard that before. So super important.
Is that why when we as females visit the doctor's office, they always ask us the date of our last period?
Yes, because it is super important to our health. So, yeah, your doctor wants to know when you had your last period, because if you had, a super long period, if you had a super short period, like these are all indicators that something could be out of balance. They also want to know if you're pregnant too, potentially, right? And, our hormones fluctuate throughout our menstrual cycle as well. So, what's kind of normal in the first half of your cycle when your estrogen is rising in your follicular phase as you approach ovulation, it's different than after ovulation when estrogen is lower and progesterone is high. And so these hormones have a huge influence on your overall health and wellness as well. So that's just indicating to your doctor, where you are in your cycle as well, because that can give them some clues as to what is going on in the bigger picture of your health. So going back to what I had talked about earlier about the length of your menstrual cycle, so many women have been taught that a menstrual cycle is 28 days long and you ovulate on day 14. And that's kind of what we are taught in junior high health class, and it's just kind of the generally accepted normal, right? But the reality is, as I said earlier, not all menstrual cycles are 28 days long, and it can be shorter. It can be 21 days. It can be 35 days. Sometimes it can even be longer than 35 days, but you can still be ovulating. And so I think that it's really important, and I advocate for women to be keeping a close eye on their cycles and some of the signs that your body is going to give you that you may be approaching ovulation or you are in your kind of fertile window and you're about to ovulate, especially for women that are hoping to get pregnant or thinking about fertility. And, if you have it in your head that ovulation happens on day 14, menstrual cycles are 28 days long, and your body has a longer or a shorter menstrual cycle and you're ovulating before or after day 14, and you're trying to get pregnant, and month after month you're not getting pregnant, it could be because you are not ovulating on day 14, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our body is very smart, and our body will tell us when we are approaching ovulation. Like I was saying earlier, periods get all the glory, but cervical mucus is fascinating and is just as important to be paying attention to. And I cannot tell you how many people have asked me about, the discharge that they are experiencing, or some women even think that they might have yeast infections every month when it is really just your normal cervical fluid that happens throughout your menstrual cycle. So as your hormones start to change, you can often start to notice. Every woman is different. So some women, they might see it in their underwear or on the toilet paper after they wipe, going to the bathroom. Other women, you might have to go looking for it, if you know what I mean. So your body will naturally produce cervical mucus. And at the start of your cycle, after you have your period, you will likely have a couple of dry days, but then you will start to produce cervical mucus. And in the beginning, it can be kind of sticky and creamy. And as your hormones change and you get closer to ovulation, it becomes thicker and stretchier. And the best way to describe it is that it looks like egg whites. So it's that kind of jiggly, stretchy cervical mucus. And that is the fertile cervical mucus. And it actually helps with sperm swimming up into to reach the egg. That's why it exists. And that will tell you when you are ovulating. So if you are trying to achieve pregnancy or if you are trying not to get pregnant, when you see that cervical egg white mucus, you know that you are in your fertile window, and that is a good time either to try for pregnancy or maybe do something else fun if you're if you don't want to have if you're not trying to get pregnant. So that is a good indicator that ovulation is near. And your body temperature also changes. And so you can take your temperature first thing in the morning, as soon as you open your eyes, after at least 3 hours of sleep. And that will give you an indicator of what your basal body temperature is. So that is your body temperature when it is completely at rest. And your temperature rises when you have ovulated. There is a slight shift in your temperature, and it will stay high after ovulation. Either you will get pregnant, if that's what you are hoping for, or if you don't fall pregnant, then you will have your period again approximately 2 weeks later, and then your temperature falls back down to kind of like the normal baseline. And it's like half a degree, I think, or maybe up to a degree. It's not a huge shift, but there's a slight shift in your body temperature after ovulation as well.
Very, very good. I know that a lot of women like to take advantage of the natural methods of tracking their fertility instead of always using pills or hormones. And I'm not judging if you are. I'm just saying that some people prefer other ways that are maybe a little less invasive or
less intervention, right?
Yeah.
I think intervention might be the word that you're looking for there. And I agree. I mean, I don't judge anybody for, the choices that they make for their bodies, but I am a huge advocate for education and learning these very basic facts about how your body works. I was, 30 years old when I started to learn more about how my menstrual cycle works. And I didn't know anything about cervical mucus or anything about ovulation until I was almost 30. And I started to feel really angry, actually, that I hadn't been taught this when I was younger, because I felt like I would have made different decisions throughout my life if I had known that, right? And I really advocate just for using, they call it fertility awareness. That's kind of the term for tracking your cycle or tracking your ovulation. I don't love that term because I think when it has the word fertility, if you are not interested in, becoming pregnant, I think it can be a little off-putting. But I think that, education and that information is a good baseline for basically anyone who has a uterus or a menstrual cycle, right? And then use that as kind of the baseline. And then you can make truly informed decisions about what is right. If you want to take hormonal birth control or if you want to, use fertility treatments. But as I was kind of alluding to earlier, sometimes just actually knowing when you're actually ovulating is going to be the key to becoming pregnant, right? Because if you are thinking that you have to ovulate on day 14 and you're not, you're ovulating on day 17 or day 20, right? You can have a longer cycle and it can still be normal. You're going to save yourself a lot of frustration.
Absolutely. Now, we alluded to it a little bit earlier in this interview, but I want to come back to another and probably maybe the I don't know if it's the most important or the second most important factor in all of this is your nutrition and your lifestyle. So can you talk a little bit about that and maybe give us some tips for how we can kind of coordinate our nutrition and lifestyle to benefit our body and, how it relates to our menstrual cycle?
Yes, of course. And as a nutritionist, I am equally passionate about that as I am about periods. So the thing about hormones, right, is that our hormones are very sensitive actually to our nutrition and to our lifestyle, which makes sense because what we eat eventually becomes our hormones, right? So I do want to preface this by saying that there comes a point, like there are a lot of women out there, especially women who have endometriosis, or they might have PCOS or other menstrual disorders, where there's not enough green juice in the world that is going to cure you, or is going to make your pain disappear, right? And so I think that food and nutrition and lifestyle is always a great place to start. And it's always going to have some benefits, but I also want to be realistic in that it's not a silver bullet, right? And there are a lot of people out there who have drank gallons of green juice and still have pain. And that's just the reality of bodies, right? But if you are kind of experiencing some of that low level PMS that we were talking about earlier, food and nutrition can be a great way to kind of alleviate some of those symptoms and get your hormones back into balance. So on the food side, I often talk to my clients about how you're eating and not just what you are eating. So making sure that you are sitting down at a table, not in a car, or on a bus, or, running from one place to another. Actually taking the time to sit down and eat is so important, because this is going to help your digestion. This is going to help to bring your stress levels down. When you are scarfing something down in the car on your way to pick up your kid from school or daycare or whatever, that's just not the way to eat, right? So making the time to eat first and foremost, I always make that a priority for my clients, because you want to be taking what you eat seriously. So number one, pay attention to how you are eating. The other kind of guiding principle when it comes to hormonal health is to actually think about your blood sugar balance. So we often hear about blood sugar, but often related just in the context of diabetes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But blood sugar is actually something that we should all be thinking about, because it has an impact on our hormonal health. And it also has just an impact on kind of our daily mood and energy as well. So if we are waking up in the morning and the first thing we put in our tank is a coffee, and we have cream and sugar in there, our blood sugar is going to spike. And so we're going to get a quick burst of energy, and then we're going to crash. And in order to recover from a blood sugar crash, we're going to start looking for kind of the quickest form of energy, which is refined carbohydrates, refined sugar. When you get hangry and you start to feel lightheaded, that's a good sign that your blood sugar is too low. And if you let that happen, you're going to be reaching for the less nutritious kind of foods, right? So you're going to look for a croissant or a cookie because your body is smart and it needs that quick energy, but then you're just going to be riding high on that sugar high again. So the constant kind of up and down of, blood sugar spike, blood sugar crash has a huge impact on our hormonal health. I'm just going to take a second to give you an aside here, Dari, which is that, we often think about hormones just in terms of like sex or our periods, but hormones are implicated in pretty much every single bodily function that our body performs, and they are like an orchestra. So they're all very finely tuned together, and when one of them kind of falls out of balance or gets out of whack, the whole orchestra gets thrown off. So that blood sugar spike and crash, that has a huge impact on your blood sugar. And the best way to keep your blood sugar balanced is to think about having a little bit of fat, a little bit of carbohydrates, and a little bit of protein every time you have a meal or a snack. So when you wake up in the morning, whole grain toast with almond butter and some banana slices and some hemp seeds sprinkled on top is a great balanced meal to start your day, because you have carbohydrates from the banana, carbohydrates from your whole grain toast, you have fat and protein in your almond butter and also in your hemp seeds. So protein, fat, and carbs. That is a great guiding principle. And that's going to help your blood sugar stay balanced, which is going to start to have a good effect on your hormones as well. And another example I like is like the apple with peanut butter, or, have a hard-boiled egg with some carrot sticks or something as an afternoon snack. So hitting all three of those things is super important on nutrition, and kind of being mindful about how much packaged, processed, refined foods that you are eating. And just, there's nothing groundbreaking that I can say about nutrition, right? Eat vegetables, right? Eat a plant-based diet. That doesn't mean be vegetarian, but it means that the majority of the food that you are eating should come from plants, fresh fruit, fresh veggies, whole grains, and then, protein. If you eat meat, protein is great, or you can have tofu or tempeh or beans, lentils, add that on top of your plants, and just be mindful about sugar, caffeine, alcohol. I don't think I'm going to blow minds by saying eat healthy. The final point that I just want to make is that stress is also a huge factor when it comes to hormonal balance and periods. And if our body is under stress, if we're feeling stressed out because of work and life, the news cycle, whatever might be stressing you out, we can also have internal stress, which comes from the food that we eat. So if we're eating kind of those junky packaged processed foods, or if we have food sensitivities that we're ignoring, and we know that dairy doesn't agree with us, but we continue to eat it anyways. I know I'm guilty of that sometimes. That can cause stress internally on our body as well. And stress has a huge effect on our hormones, and it can even delay ovulation as well. So your body is not going to ovulate if it's too stressed out. And that can delay your period, make your cycle longer, and throw your hormones out of whack.
These are really key tenets. Like you said, they're not new tenets, but they're really, really key. And this is, as we, air this episode, the time of year where people are all wanting to assess their lives and make changes. Maybe not necessarily lose weight or whatever, but definitely there's something in your life, health-wise, physically, emotionally, where you say, you know what, I can improve in this area. And so, this ties into our period, because just like you were talking about, if you know that dairy doesn't agree with you, but you continue to eat it, and, how does that affect your period and your cycle?
Well, it can cause stress and inflammation in your body, which can delay ovulation, or it can throw your hormonal balance out of whack. So we might have too much estrogen, or we might have not enough estrogen, or we might have too much progesterone or not enough progesterone. So these things can make our periods longer or shorter, can delay ovulation. And dairy is a sticky one, because when you think about what dairy is, for lack of, a more elegant way of putting it, is breast milk for baby cows, right? And so like we all recognize that there's hormones in our own breast milk, and the same thing goes for cows or goats or sheep or whatever, animal milk that you might be drinking. And so when you are ingesting dairy, you're getting those hormones as well, which is going to have an impact on your hormones, and it can be very inflammatory. And so when we have inflammation in our body, it just interrupts, our overall health and wellness, and it can have an effect on hormones. It sounds like a cliche to say, but we really are what we eat. It really is that simple. And so if you're eating a lot of dairy products, or, you're eating a lot of meat that has been, injected with growth hormones or antibiotics, that's going to become part of us as well. So just something to consider.
This has been such an enlightening episode. I have to say, you are the first person to go in on the menstrual flow on Kicking It with Doree, and I thank you so much for sharing just a couple of nuggets of wisdom in these last 30 minutes or so. Can you please share with us how we can follow your podcast, the Heavy Flow podcast, and how we can connect with you as well?
Yeah, of course. So the Heavy Flow podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, it's Stitcher, Google Play Music, wherever you get your podcasts. So you can find it there. And you can visit my website, amandalaird.ca. And I'm on Facebook. You can look up Amanda Laird and the Heavy Flow podcast. And you can also follow me on Instagram at Amanda Laird.
Amanda, thank you again for joining us on the show. Follow her on Instagram and Facebook and every place where you use social media. And if you didn't catch that, you can always connect to her through the show notes for this episode at kickingitwithdoree.com. Send your questions and comments about this show to kickingit@DoreeAllen.com. That's KICKINIT. There's no G. At DoreeAllen.com. Or you can use Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter to get to me at Doree Allen.